Thank you, and hello everyone for joining us and watching yet again. My name is Dr. Jules. I am joined here by one of my favorite people in the entire world, Dustin. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm Dustin Baldwin. I have known Jules for a very long time, since college, and I have been involved in quite a bit of mostly D&D, but other tabletop environments as well. I moonlight as a professional painter once in a while. If you ever want to see if I'm working on anything, you can just check out Mad Artificer Creations on Instagram or Facebook. I'm a very busy man, so sometimes I post, sometimes I don't. Sometimes you might think I just disappeared off the face of the earth and I come back 3 days later. It's fine.
Well, I brought in Dustin today as one of my favorite people to talk D&D and tabletop because Dustin is all about the homebrew. You know, making races, making classes, making subclasses, and classes is really what we're going to focus on today. With 5e and all of the different homebrews that are running around with Cobalt Press, with DM's Guild, all of the different resources out there, you can play 5e, you can play Pathfinder. There's so many different of these D20 systems. But the thing that kind of all links them together, right, is you have to make a character. And what's the main thing that defines characters for most people? It's your class. Every RPG system at some point has to have a class of some kind, right? I mean, Dustin, what's your favorite class?
Hmm. I mean, barbarian usually. However, I am very obviously partial to the artificer or artificer, however you pronounce it.
Hence the name of the
Because
channel.
yeah, mad science, engineering. You don't need to be a wizard if you've got a firearm and a grenade. So,
Personally, I've never hit in this. I'm very partial to bards. Love a good bard. But each system, Pathfinder has a bard, and D&D 5th edition have bards. And they're very different in many ways, but they're similar in very many ways. And all of these different systems, even without the name of the class there, when you say it, you kind of know exactly what they're talking about, right? We when I say fighter, everyone has the same image of that warrior with a sword and a shield and a spear, that simple warrior with training and dedication. Your thief, and you think of different archetypes of the rogue that kind of come with this. Your cleric is your traditional holy person with a book and a staff. And we see those tropes and we see that common idea across all the different systems, right? Even in if the mechanics might be different, the flavor of one system's cleric and the flavor of another system's cleric aren't going to be that much different, right? But then what's that thing that does make them different, right? What makes this bard and what makes that bard any different from one another, right? What makes those differences matter? So today, with a little bit of help from Dustin here, also to help me not just ramble on and on and on, we're going to look today at the things that actually make a class matter. What gives your class that specific identity? What makes a druid different than a cleric? What makes a cleric different than a wizard? And we're going to look at mostly 5th edition, but across kind of all of these various, mostly D20 systems. What is the important trait that makes a class what it is? So today we're kind of going to look at some of the mechanics. We're going to look at the play style involved with that class, as well as then just the lore, the flavor, the story and narrative that kind of comes instilled with each class. And we're going to see what among those make all of the classes what they are. Before we start, any thoughts from you, Dustin, kind of on the subject?
my view is the idea that 5e doesn't really it's very simple. It's basic. It's good to pick up. And that's kind of a fix and a problem. And to me, 5e's mechanics are far more about just what fits the category instead of Pathfinder, where it's more rigidly defined.
Yeah,
And we'll get into that with like fluff and flavor versus mechanics and everything later.
yeah, and yeah,
Um,
and it'll be worth bringing up too. But there's definitely a lot of the specifics of this conversation, right, are going to depend not just on your system, but just do you have kind of a fluffy system or do you have a real crunchy system? But yeah, so I guess just in general, kind of looking at a lot of these ideas, I don't know. I want to go right off the bat and just say that I'm going to use the word trope a lot here. You know, the bard follows under the trope of the wandering musician or the trope of the horny bard, right? Trope, when we use it most of the time, is a negative term. We use it, we say it like it's a bad thing because it's a stereotype that a story or a character kind of falls in. But tropes don't have to be a bad thing. And I think, especially in the context that we're talking about right now, I don't think that tropes have to be a bad thing. Giving players a little bit of structure in a system that can start with you can do whatever you want and make whatever you want, I think can be kind of important. I've seen so many new people go in and be told you can do whatever you want and create whatever you want. And that analysis paralysis just bogs down on them. There's too many countless options. But the structure that can come from a good RPG trope, the structure that can come with here is this stereotypical character. Now you use this as a launching point. You don't have to just play your dumb barbarian. But good dumb barbarian is a good starting point for a lot of new players that aren't exactly sure what kind of character they want to make. This structure can be a good thing.
I mean, yeah, I've been DMing for, good lord, what, 10 years
Something like
plus
that.
at this point? I'd like to play at some point. Uh, and I mean, almost every one of my players across my campaigns has been new. I have
Mm-hmm.
taught them, how to play. Tropes, the archetypes are good and bad, like you said. I mean, it's overwhelming, especially if you were to go to Pathfinder 2e from nothing and just see all the feat trees and everything, you'd be totally lost. But
Mm-hmm.
they have archetypes, they have pre-made ideas that you can just slot in and call it a day. I used to get upset when people would base their character on something that pre-existed in media because I was a little stuck up and I wanted to be special. And now I realize that's a good comfort point. That's a starting point for them to kind of develop on their own.
Yeah.
Like, yes, obviously you are playing, a hunter from Destiny. Fine, cool. But you know what? You're comfortable, you're happy, you're doing a good time. But that was kind of the moment that I realized, oh, tropes aren't necessarily bad. They're a good starting point. If you rely on it too much, though, then it's a problem.
Well, I mean, from there, let's kind of just go into kind of the first of these three pillars that I've kind of tried to make. Let's look at mechanics here. And by mechanics, we mean, as written in the rules, the abilities, the class features, however you want to call it, but the mechanical powers that each individual class has. So you mentioned wizard. So what are the abilities? What are the mechanics of a wizard? They have spell casting, obviously. They have their spell book and the ability to take spells from other written sources and put it into the book. They have their different subclass features. When you look at a barbarian, what are the mechanics of a barbarian? They rage, they attack recklessly, they don't have to wear armor, they run really fast. Those are kind of what I mean when I'm talking about mechanics. Now, a lot of mechanics obviously are going to be shared between classes. There's a lot of spellcasters. There's a lot of classes that gain an extra attack as part of their action. But there's plenty of mechanics that are specific to one particular class, right?
I mean, if you look at, for example, clerics, they can call upon their deity.
Mm-hmm.
That's just, that is a class ability. Same with turn undead. That's a major cleric ability. And they get the wizard equivalent of divine spellcasting. But otherwise, the mechanics are pretty open. So
And the
the other big one,
mm-hmm.
if you look at sorcerers versus wizards, they both have arcane spellcasting. Sorcerers have less, but whatever spells they know, and they can pop them off however they want. Wizards, depending on the edition, have either the highest in curve, I'm gonna say, or the second highest curve, because they have to know all their spells, both the player and the actual wizard, put them in a book, and if you take the book, they can't cast their spells. And then they have to prepare those spells each day. So you have to sit down, and you only get so many you can pull out of all the ones you know, and decide, what do I want to use today? Instead of just rolling up and going, I've got these spells, I'm going to do what I want with them, the wizard has to sit down and go, okay, what am I doing today? And that's a good example of how to differentiate two very similar classes in wildly different ways, even without subclasses. Because a wizard's school is I learned how to do necromancy, I learned how to do abjuration. A sorcerer's subclasses are, yeah, somebody, I don't know, man, I'm part demon, just roll with it. Or, I've got dragon blood, it's fine, I can do weird stuff.
Now, the thing about the mechanics, though, the mechanics are going to be the thing that most changes what it feels like for us as a player. The mechanic is the thing that changes, okay, what is the difference between playing a sorcerer and what is the difference between playing a wizard? But we're looking here at how these mechanics give an identity, how these mechanics shape and decide what a class is and like who a class is. But I mean, looking at that example that I can pull from, bards get bardic inspiration, right? That is one of their core like mechanical identities. Is they have that D6, that D8, that D10. They have that bardic inspiration die that they can give to their friends to make them more powerful. But is that it? Is that, I mean, is all that a bard is just I am a character that can give a D whatever inspiration die to my allies, and that's what makes me a bard? Because in that case, I mean, the current season of Critical Role, Sam Riegel is playing a little robot cleric who can give a D6, essentially an inspiration die, to some of his allies as part of his cleric subclass. He's doing the exact same thing when he was playing a bard. He's giving a inspiration die that can be added to bonuses or that can be added to skill checks, to attack rolls. But he's not a bard, but mechanically he is doing what we know as the bard thing. So does that mean that he's running a cleric bard? Is it just a mechanic that is being taken from one class and used to the other? How involved in the total process of deciding this character and deciding its identity does adding a D8 to a skill check make?
So I would say that is a core bard thing,
Mm-hmm.
but what a lot of people tend to skip over are bards are some of the best skill users in the game.
True.
They get jack of all trades. So even if they don't know what they're doing, they know enough of convincing you of what they're doing
They're
that
still
you think they're
okay.
doing it right. They get a ton of skill proficiencies.
Mm-hmm.
So if all you look at is combat, yes, they have inspiration. Some of them can attack twice, not a big deal. But if you take the social aspect, the exploring aspect, all the other aspects of D&D and TTRPGs, they shine outside of combat. To me, if we're looking at the core identity of a bard and you were to just strip away all the flavor and everything, you have a person who has knowledge of what to do and when to do it, and can sometimes spread that knowledge to other people. They're very support oriented just looking at it.
Right, but in that,
Because nobody said, yeah, go ahead.
but even in that though, we're already starting to slowly move away from mechanics and move towards play style there. And we can't, it's not like there's a circle here and a circle here and a circle here. Like this is a big Venn diagram. All of these different pillars all interact and all of them touch one another. It's impossible to keep those things separate.
Yeah, I mean, you have to figure out playstyle in order to write the mechanics. I have learned that the hard way, that you just cannot fully separate them. But I think it's important to note that if you take away everything else and just look at the mechanics, they will still tell you usually the story of what you're trying to do.
Hmm.
They will point you into, I'm not going to say the optimum way to play them, but the consensus of the way to play
Intended.
them.
There can be
Yeah.
there yeah there is clearly an intended way to use many of these classes. One thing that I did want to bring up is that we have a lot of these class features that we consider specific and core to the identity of different classes. Eldritch invocations for warlocks and meta magic casting for sorcerers, obviously. But the longer that 5e goes on as a system, the more we see either feats or subclasses that the entire point of that subclass or feat or whatever seems to be okay, so you're playing this class. You know that class over there that has its core thing that's really cool? We're going to steal it and we're going to let you use it. Anytime that I ever see a video that talks about multi-classing or making the perfect build or anything like that, whenever the conversation comes up of, you could dip into sorcerer and you could get a couple levels of sorcerer, get some meta magic casting, eventually the conversation just turns into, well, why would I want to be a sorcerer? when I could be whatever class I want and then just take the feat that gives me meta magic proficiency. Or, I'm a warlock and I could go with a warlock paladin build because who doesn't want to be a warlock paladin? Or I could just take those Eldritch invocations that clearly are intended to steal the smite, and I'm just going to smite not as a paladin, but smite as a warlock, stealing that core identity mechanic from the paladin. And I think the longer 5e goes on, the more of this that we're kind of seeing. We were talking before kind of the way that mechanics influence the way that we actually play the character. And also the way that they wanted us to play the character influences the way that they write the mechanics. So let's just go right into that next pillar for me is the play style. Different classes, that play style is almost thought of so much that it is built into the class itself. What do you do with a barbarian and a paladin? You're on the front line fighting. What do you do if you're a wizard? You are in the back casting spells. What do you do if you're a rogue? You are hiding and getting little sneak attacks and attacking out of surprise and out of stealth whenever possible. Those play styles you mentioned before, the bard is a support play style. Certain classes lend themselves towards that play style. But does an inherent play style, does that impact the core identity of a class the way that we think about it? The same way with some of these mechanics?
I think it's a little bit more system dependent. For 5e, the biggest thing about melee is just health. That's it. When you look at a wizard, even a blade singer. So let's say they cast mage armor and they get themselves some great AC. They've pumped all their stuff into strength and con for some reason,
Mm-hmm.
and they are built to be the weirdest magical little tank on the field. They don't necessarily have a big enough hit dice to back it up.
They still
Unlike, for
only,
example, a barbarian who is literally made of meat and rage.
yeah.
You can play with it, you can find ways, but mechanically it is somewhat limited in terms of how aggressive you can be with your class.
But but even
Now,
but even there, like the Blade Singer is like the example I think of a class or a subclass intended to go against the implied or the intended playstyle. Wizards, you sit in the back, you're squishy, you're made of paper, you don't want anyone to hit you. The Blade Singer is the wizard that says, screw that, I'm going to run up to the front and I'm going to start swinging at people. You have Sword and Valor bards that instead of being the support caster, they're running right up to the front and they're using their charisma to swing at people. Even the cleric, and granted, this is 5e, so clerics are amazing at everything, right? But when you think of clerics, typically think of a supporter and a healer. So a little tanky, but mostly the support healer. But then you roll up with a Tempest cleric, and now everything goes zap. So there's even if there is like the wizard, we know that the intended wizard playstyle is to sit in the back. You don't have to, though. And there's so many classes and subclasses that define themselves as I'm going to go against that expectation.
I think the biggest example of mechanics and intended playstyle in 5e is one of the simplest things that drives me nuts. A paladin can't normally smite with a ranged weapon. Right there. There is no reason, in my mind, that the power of God cannot be channeled through an arrow or a bullet as easily as it can be through an axe or a mace.
Yeah.
And so that forces melee builds for paladins because they can't really spell sling. They can a little easier now with Tasha's. But that forces the intended playstyle.
Right. You're not required to play a melee build paladin, but if you're not, the way that the game is set up, it is going to actively punish you for not filling in kind of that role. So at
Yeah.
least in 5e, we've got examples like the paladin, where if you go against the intended playstyle, the mechanics of the game are going to weaken your overall character and your effectiveness. You've got cases like the Blade Singer, where a subclass is being created specifically to go against that intended implied playstyle. But in that last case, because that's the one that I find really interesting, having one specific build or the ability to make a build that goes against this like intended core playstyle or whatever, does that show us that the playstyle is less important to the class's identity because you can split off and do a lot of things with it? Or does that imply, because it's showing that the Bladesinger is an exception to the rule, does the exception to the rule prove that the rule is this powerful guiding force?
So again, looking at Pathfinder versus 5e,
Mm-hmm.
Pathfinder 2e is much more rigid in terms of what a class can do. The mechanics are much more balanced than 5e overall. Everything is kind of more tailored. And instead of going against type per se, you just get more options in Pathfinder 2e. The Barbarian in 5e, you look at it, their identity, their class mechanics, all of that. You're expected to be in melee, you're expected to be raging, you're not expected to be using any kind of range.
Right.
Because why would you? Like, oh, you're gonna rage throw a javelin? That's weird. Pick up an axe and go for it.
Mm-hmm.
Pathfinder 2e said, we hear you, but we don't want to alter the core class ideas. So what if we made you really good at just picking things up and throwing them?
I love that.
And maybe it's another person. You know,
I love that.
to me, that's a much better idea of kind of going against class without losing any of the identity of the class.
Again, though, in that case, we're going into, again, more of the conversation of fluffy versus crunchy
Yeah.
systems and mechanics.
See, at the same time, though, they lay those mechanics out spot on. To me, that still wraps back to, for example, the Bladesinger showing is the playstyle the exception or not. The biggest problem with 5e, especially in terms of this conversation, is they didn't really set out a rigid playstyle for any of the classes to begin with, other than basic, this rule says you can't do this, or you just don't have the HP to do it.
So that's interesting. So it's not a case where people aren't accepting a playstyle because they have abilities that push them in that way, but there are rules that hinder the ability to go after certain playstyles. So you're you're
Yes.
you're running away from a stick. You're not chasing a carrot.
Yes.
Hmm. I mean,
So,
yeah, but like core differences there again. 5e is the fluffy tabletop system right now. And more than that, like fluffy means that they want the rules to be doing less work, and like objectively they want the dungeon master to be doing more of that work there. Well, you know what? Let's pop there. Let's talk about this last and this final kind of pillar of this class identity that I really want to talk about here. And here we're talking about the lore, the flavor, like the narrative that goes into a class and says what it is. What's the difference between a fighter and a paladin? They're both heavy armored frontliners that melee and they swing a big sword. Well, one got their power through training and dedication, the other has their energy and their power through their conviction and their oath. What's the difference between a wizard and a sorcerer? Well, the wizard got all of their magic by reading books and learning. The sorcerer got their powers from innate bloodlines and having a natural, immediate connection to magic. Especially the thing that separates so many different spellcasters just comes down to the flavor of where did the magic come from. But how important is that flavor, that story of where an adventurer's powers came from? How important is that flavor, that lore to the identities of these different classes?
I would say they're kind of, on the one hand, very critical. On the other hand, not at all. Um,
Great down the road answers. Good stuff.
I know. And to explain, so I told you about that wizard idea I had. You said, why
Mm-hmm.
isn't it a warlock? The core lore of a wizard is I have spent time, dedication, intelligence. I have learned, I have embraced, and I have sought out so much on my own and researched. To me, that's the core of the wizard. That's it.
Yeah.
Now, maybe your wizard uses a traditional spell book because they went to an academy. That's a common wizard trope we see a lot.
Yeah.
The wizard I talked about with you instead used spell tags for his spells each day. And instead of traditional, I went to an academy and I learned the secrets of, magic, like reading it like code. It's I have learned the traditions of my people, I have learned traditions of the spirits we talk to, and I have learned how to keep the knowledge of those people with me in a book that helps me translate my spells. They're both wizards. Mechanically, they function the same, but they're wildly different.
But their stories come from different places.
Yeah. So that's why I say it's both super critical and not at all, because as long as you follow the idea of the rules that lay out this person that has studied, that has invested all this time and effort.
So it's not, but it's not about. There's the initial. There's the core. Not even the lore, but there's the core idea again. But the what is the lore of the wizard is this long, but the important part
Mhm.
is the first sentence, and everything else through flavor and backstory, the character and the DM can kind of change it. That's the point of view you're giving,
Yeah.
and I think I vibe with that. And my example that I come from is a player character that I'm playing right now. I played it 2 nights ago. One of my characters that I'm very proud of is Rydal of House Nightingale. Rydal is a noble Eladrin elf, but he comes from a very well-to-do royal family. The heads of his family have been leading his local community and their city-state for generations and generations now. They are your typical elven noble family bloodline, and he is very well-to-do and very well raised and educated. But in his family, what decides who's going to take next house is whoever can find the most accolades. Whoever can go out there and bring the most glory and honor to the family name becomes the next head of state. So for Rydal, while he is this traditional diplomat, he is also the type where he needs to get as much glory and acclaim for himself on a personal level as he can on his adventurers. So I talk about this character to people, an intelligent, diplomatic elf from a noble family who is going out to try and find accolades and stories of glory for himself. That character is a barbarian. He is a lawful neutral, noble background elf barbarian. And all of the mechanics even come down to the flavor. He doesn't wear armor because it looks less cool than if he just goes out there in his beautiful, noble silken robes and dispatches a monster looking ready for an oil painting at any point in time. He is reckless and attacks with abandon because if he dies on this quest, he died bringing glory and acclaim to his family's name. And it is better to be dead than not to be head of this house. All of these characters, but a noble elf barbarian doesn't make any sense to the lore and the flavor of Conan the Barbarian or something like that.
So that's a really interesting tidbit because that build would not have happened until 5e. Uh,
Yes, yeah,
Asterisk, I have not played 4e. Used to, you had alignment restrictions on your classes, and in 3.5, if a barbarian was ever lawful, they lost all their barbarian powers.
they were also at base mechanic purposely illiterate, which
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. So I am
yeah.
aware that this is a 5e specific build, but that's a case where I went with what is the core concept of the barbarian. They are the frontline fighter that throws themselves without thinking of personal safety to attack their enemies. And I wanted to take that into the flavor of a young noble that wanted to bring as much accolade and glory to himself and his family as he could, ignoring every other little bit of flavor that we think of barbarians. Let's get rid of all of that. Let's just keep the one line of lore that I care about.
And I think personally that's one of the strengths of 5e. You can kind of mess around with what was intended.
Even core
Oh,
stuff that was intended with the game, though, like trickery clerics. Trickery cleric goes against everything that you think of with the stereotypical cleric. You think of the holy person, very like lawful good, holier than thou, following the laws of the land and being pious and just. And now you have Jester from Critical Role stealing things from people, drawing penises on everything, causing mischief and destruction everywhere that she goes. But that's how it's written. That's how they want the flavor of this particular cleric intended to be against this stereotype that they've been building since the 70s.
yeah. I think part of that is they decided the cleric should be more about devotion, than necessarily
which
piousness.
was smart, which was great.
Yeah. I mean, they did the same thing with the Paladin and it helped a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Just that switch to following your guide more than following what people think you should be doing was a huge change.
I think of these
Hmm.
three pillars that I've set up. I think this lore, this like flavor, the narrative going in that kind of defines the classes, it's the one that I least care about because it's the one, again, we've just, every example we've just talked about is us as DMs or as players reflavoring the lore of that class for our particular character, which I think most players by their second or third character they make are doing anyway. But the main one is that mechanics in playstyle, okay, those come from the game itself, which is fine. The game should in some way instruct the way that you build a character for that game. That makes sense. That's the point of the system. But most of this lore doesn't come from the game. Most of that comes from outside influences. And outside influences are great. And I talked about tropes are great because they help give you a structure. Until that structure imposes on what you want to do. A fence is great until it becomes a cage. And a lot of these classes, barbarians, why do we think of barbarians as these unintelligent, like drooling, muscle headed morons? Because we've had decades of every barbarian that we see in media following that set pattern. We've seen Conan the Barbarian taught us that Arnold the Barbarian has to be big and a little dumb and hulking and swing a big weapon. Lord of the Rings, granted, built all of D&D off of its back, right? Or at, like you talk about, like those sword and sorcery kind of style, like Pulp Fiction novels from earlier than that. But this is the thing for me that it doesn't come from D&D, but it decides what people's characters and classes can and can't be, and that's kind of why I'm not a fan of it.
I mean, a lot of that I think is there for the newer players. It
Mm.
is unofficially the rule that isn't a rule.
Mm.
So to me, the flavor of the class, the lore, the ideas, I mean, especially the moment you get into homebrew, it's over.
Right.
Um, a lot of that is very much based on welcome. These are the core ideas, should you choose to use them, and these will help you get your stories going.
Mm.
I mean, the joke is like your first character is, a media person, like somebody you've seen. They're based on somebody.
Yeah.
Your fifth character is borderline a cryptid, and I don't know if the rules support it, but we're going to try it. Because a lot of that just falls by the wayside. Uh,
See, and you're right, and I totally vibe with the idea of having an idea of what a character in a class is kind of supposed to be going in helps new players, and that's great as long as it's an implication. The problem is, like going back to 3.5, that then there were cases where that narrative becomes parts of the mechanic that restrict what a character can do, like making it so a barbarian can't read, making it so that a barbarian has to be a chaotic nature, making it so that the paladin has to be a lawful nature by default. Things, limiting mechanics like that that don't come from a we're doing this to change your playstyle or we're doing this as a mechanic, but just limitations put on just because it doesn't fit the flavor of what the class should be. That's silly. Those are the ones that I don't like.
yeah, I mean, that's why we're in 5th edition instead of 3.5 still. The game has changed, understanding has changed, goals have changed. I mean, if you go back and you look at 1st edition D&D, uh, love Gary to pieces. Oh my God, I think he hated his players. And so that's part of it too, is this idea of more being storytelling and all of that. It's kind of, I'm not gonna say new, but the focus has shifted
Yes, I agree.
from how heavily crunchy and ordered everything was to opening up to different forms of media, to supporting different ideas. To me, 3.5 was kind of the change, looking at the older stuff versus the newer stuff, because you eventually got some really weird stuff in 3.5 that just kind of went, you know what? Why not? Why not? But I think 5e was just a whole new ballgame. And I think your idea of stuff being restricted is we moved away from it because as a whole, everybody kind of realized it was not fun.
Yeah.
That was a mechanic that got left for a reason. I think TTRPGs as a whole are now either they're kind of dividing into this is really crunchy or this is really fluffy, and they're letting people choose which one they want at that stage.
But that, I mean, that's a great tie-in right there. Is these three pillars of kind of, play style, mechanics, and lore were kind of the three ways that I looked at the identity of different classes. Yeah, you brought more of a binary between it. So why don't you talk us through that?
So again, just looking at, for example, there's a TTRPG called Lancer.
Mm-hmm.
It's a sci-fi mecha RPG. And when you're in mech combat, it's very crunchy. It's very like wargamey. When you're not, it is super loose with the rules. I mean, it's called narrative mode, and it's basically like 5 minutes.
The game even mechanically like notes like that there are differences. That's very interesting to me.
Yeah. It notes very heavily, like, and obviously, like, this is narrative mode. This is mech combat mode.
Neat.
Don't mix.
Okay.
And then the other thing is 5e has kind of become like Skyrim in terms of it's its own thing on its own, but everybody mods it to the point you can't recognize it. It's a storytelling engine at this point. It is technically a game.
But yeah, it's more a platform.
Yeah, it's easy to modify to whatever you want. And I've seen some really bonkers stuff, some stuff that made me question my sanity, and I've seen a lot of really cool stuff as well. It's just it's open enough to be accessible to anybody. And that's what's most important to me. But looking at the binary of crunch versus fluff, if you only want crunch, go play a war game. If you only want fluff, go write a book. The beauty of TTRPGs is sitting down with your friends and figuring out what you want most and putting those together. So, for my Michigan friends, I'm sure they would love Pathfinder 2e way more if they took the time to learn it. Because they are very crunchy, they're very numbery. They still want a story, but they want the numbers to be important. For someone like me, the fluff binary is far more important than the crunch. I routinely tell people I do run 5e, at least it used to be.
At least it used to be. Going off this idea then of, we have fluffy systems and we have crunchy systems. For the fluffy system, what would you say are the most important elements of like defining class identity then?
For a fluffy system, a class identity is more about what you can do.
Hmm. And then the crunchy system, the class is defined, but what they cannot do.
Correct.
Hmm.
Because a fluffy system, to me, you can kind of do whatever, but some people are going to be way better at certain things than others. Or they
Right.
might have special abilities that function better than others. A crunchy system is going to lay it out quite clearly what you can't do because it'll probably break something.
Yeah. And it will tell you in the rules you can do this and you cannot do this. Yeah,
Yes.
it makes sense, right? But the crunchy play style then obviously defined by mechanics.
Basically, to me, a crunchy system, the rules define the class.
Mm-hmm.
For a fluffier system, the class influences the rules.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. All right. Kind of just a couple random kind of thoughts I had kind of closing out on this. Going back to my three pillars system,
Mhm.
it's pretty obvious to me that each one of those pillars influences the other. Wizards and having to stay in the back. For me, that comes from the play style is influenced by the lore of the wizard not being a frontliner, but also the mechanic of no armor, low HP, you have to stay in the back. Versus my rogue and being sneaky, that's from the lore of wanting to sneak around, but fulfilling the play style of moving around and being this sneak thief.
Right. And I think 5e falls more on that fluffy style versus crunch,
Oh, for sure.
where nowhere does it say your wizard can't go ham with a hammer or a shotgun, whatever. Like, you can. Just other people are better at it.
Yeah. Just at the end of the day, it doesn't. You're going to be great with that. I mean, you can have a 20 strength and all of that. You're never
Yeah.
going to get past that D6 hit die.
Yeah.
Yeah, toughness
So
can
it's
only
just
get you
other
so
people
far.
do it better.
Yeah.
So versus Pathfinder, it's like, I mean, no, you can't. Look, your attack bonus with melee is terrible. Stay in the back, dude. Pathfinder is very much more crunchy, and it is a definitive don't do that.
And I will, again, with the comparison to Pathfinder, make the important note here that I think a lot of, especially in tabletops as a whole, a lot of the reason why a lot of these core identities and these concepts feel so rigid is because D&D is such a big part of the community and part of it that you cannot play a tabletop in 2023 that isn't either influenced by D&D or makes a decision to spite D&D. Like, I'm going to make the decision of why do apocalypse games use the D6 system? Sure, it's simple, but because they need to differentiate from a D20 system. So I've seen this Pathfinder, the classes in Pathfinder and the classes in D&D look very similar to one another. The further you get away from D&D as a system, once you get to Kids with Bikes, once you get to Call from Cthulhu, once you get to Lancer, the further from the core D&D system you get, the more that those classes open up because they're not restricted to following that D&D example anymore. And I think that is something of a limiting factor in Pathfinder because it is so closely adjacent, kind of in that shadow of D&D, and then a lot of homebrew coming from 5e has to kind of follow in that. But the further you get from that original D&D system, the more flexibility you have, the more that you can get out of that trope that wizards that Gary defined decades ago.
Yeah, and I would honestly, I'd say since I look at things as a binary, 5e and Pathfinder are the binary in terms of how I look at things and class design. Because you're right, everything is more rigid in Pathfinder. You can't do as much per class. Pathfinder also has way more classes to accommodate that.
What?
So
Yeah.
not only is it going farther away from those in terms of class design, either direction, it becomes also how focused do you want your rules to be when you design your classes.
Again, crunchy and fluffy.
Because the more you want the mechanics to influence them, the more you want crunch. You kind of teeter on the edge of a war game.
Yeah. Eventually, yeah.
However, if you want lighter and lighter, at some point you're just kind of sitting around the campfire telling a story together. And I think part of that is what rules you write, if it's a crunchy system, will far more determine what people make. And if it's a fluffy system, it's more about finding the system that fits the story you want to tell.
Yeah. I think that kind of wraps up our discussion. Dustin, again,
Okay.
thank you for joining me. I'll always love talking to you and your big bald head. Tell us again, tell everyone watching, where can we find you online? Where can we find what you do?
When I come out of hiding, I'm on Instagram and Facebook as Mad Artificer Creations. Between the ADHD and children, I forget to post things a lot. So, you know,
And of course, anyone that wants to find any of those socials, I will be linking them obviously in the description to this video below. Thank you everyone for kind of listening to Dustin and I do what we would have done on a Sunday anyway and just kind of chit chat about D&D and all the weird little thoughts we have on it.
thanks
Again,
for listening.
oh yeah, thanks for listening to us. Do all that usual online stuff. Give me a like and a subscribe. Comment if you think that we're totally off the rocker here, or comment how we're the idiot savants of D&D and they should let us write the nuts system. My name is Dr. Jules, and have a nice day, everyone.